No, I enjoyed that very much. Thanks so much, Ken. That's a great introduction. Let me get started, first of all, I guess, by introducing myself. My name's Phil Hawksworth, as you just heard. I work at Netlify as part of the developer experience team. As you heard, I've traveled over from London. I'm delighted to be here in your wonderful city with its various deep-fried meats that I will be working my way through over the course of the next couple of days. So we're not going to have time for questions and answers during this talk. And also, if you're watching the recording of this, of course, can't be here to answer those to ask those questions. You can always reach me on social media. I'm at Phil Hawksworth on Twitter. Helpful for me because that's my name, so I can remember it. You've got to do a bit more work. I'm less active on Twitter now than I used to be. I'm more on Mastodon, but you can find me in most places. Feel free to ask me questions there or grab me around the conference. I'm very happy to talk about things there. Maybe I should just stop referring to other places and I should point you to my website. I have a domain of my own that I registered years ago. It's the first example of how naming is hard, and that's a theme that we might return to. Hawksworks, I thought was cool 30 years ago or whatever it was when I registered that domain. I thought, drop the last couple of letters of your name, put an X on it, that's cool. No one knows how to pronounce that, no one knows how to spell it when I tell them it. Naming is hard, and that is a theme, as I mentioned, we'll return to, because fair warning, this slide is in your future. This is coming to you down the way, because naming is very, very difficult, and we'll get to that. I should also mention, this is going to be a slight change of pace after Evan's talk. I'm going to try and pitch to you the idea that that's a feature and not a bug. But it's difficult to follow Evan and all the amazing news that's coming down the line for the future of Vue. It's really, really exciting. But what I thought I would try and do is I would try and lay some foundations for maybe one or two of the other talks that are coming along. We're definitely going to hear some more details about what I'm going to talk about later on, and we'll get into that. So I really want to talk about some of the fundamentals that I think are going to be important. My talk, by the way, has been ruined this morning already by Ken, who said, no, we're not doing nerd puns today. He said that at 9:03. Thanks for your help, Ken. So the last 30 minutes or so, I've just been feverishly ripping out huge chunks of my talk, but it helps it fit into the time, so that's helpful. But what we are going to be talking about is rendering, and you've heard the word rendering a couple of times already today. And some of this is going to be very, very familiar to many of you, and I know there's a broad spectrum of experiences around the room, so hopefully this is still going to be useful to a lot of you as well. But when I'm talking about rendering, what I'm really describing there is returning HTML or manipulating the DOM in the browser, doing the things that let the browser paint the view for you. And this term rendering, that's kind of evolved over the years. That never used to be the term we used to use once upon a time. About 10 years ago, I was at the party before a conference, and I was kind of talking about some similar things. I don't change very much over time, it turns out. And I used this expression to someone I was talking to. I was saying something, rendering on the server, and their response to me at the time was, ha, do you just mean serving HTML? Which I did, because at the time, we didn't really used to talk about rendering things on the server. We used to talk about generating HTML and sending it down the line to the client. And once upon a time, the web was kind of simpler. We used to have web servers that had assets on them, and we had client browsers that would come along and ask for those resources, and they would create a view of whatever they found. Over time, the servers became more intelligent, more active. They became application servers, if you like, where not only would they be serving the assets, but they would be manipulating them. They would be customizing what the response was that was going to get sent down the wire through some sort of compute stage. And then over time, that compute always also came to the client. JavaScript evolved as the runtime for the web, if you like. This exists in all of our browsers. And so we're starting to do compute and manipulation there in the client as well. So this is all expanded over time, but one of the things that I really, really care about as someone who loves the web is robustness. It's one of the cornerstones of the principles that supports the web. And you may have come across this, the rule of least power, which is one of the kind of design principles of the web, which broadly speaking kind of suggests that you should choose the least powerful language that is suitable for any given purpose. Try and bias towards simplicity wherever possible. And I'm really keen on that. And it's the kind of thing that isn't always exciting, but I think it's really fundamental to the web being sustainable and robust. And so, when we look at this situation of, more things happening on servers and more things happening on clients, there's just a lot more places where things can happen and things can go wrong. And in fact, I'm quite keen on simplifying wherever possible, as I mentioned. So I got quite enticed by the idea of the servers becoming dumb again, if you like, and moving some of that compute to an earlier stage. So perhaps in a build server where, things are computed and generated there, rendered, if you like, there, so they can be served in the dumbest, simplest possible way. And over time, we started to see more places where compute can happen and rendering can happen. Now we've got this thing, the edge, which I'll talk about shortly. But ultimately, we've got all of these different places where things can happen, and understanding where we should do those things when it's appropriate is kind of what I want to talk about a little bit today. So we're very, very fortunate in the Vue ecosystem that we've got tools like Nux that can actually address all of these different parts of this request chain, if you like, and do rendering in different places there. When you can read that, I'll read it out for you. But part of the Nux site does talk about how it can support on-demand rendering for a bunch of different things like SSR, SSG, CSR, ISR, ESR, SWR. Oh, I look at that and it's exciting, but I kind of driven to say by thunder, there are a lot of ways to approach rendering. And so what I've seen over time is that there's some complexity and there's confusion that creeps in. It's only natural when there are so many ways that we can do what once seemed like a simple thing. It's really important that we understand what's the best place for rendering to happen. But I think one of the things that we often overlook is that it's also important to understand that there's a best time and a place. When we do the rendering is just as important as where we do it. And so my kind of goal for this talk for the next 25 minutes or so is to talk about the what, where, when, not how, but why we can tackle rendering. Later today, Sebastian Chopin will do a talk about Vue and the edge. I think we might dig into some more of these aspects there. I'm not going to talk about how, I'm really going to talk about some of these other aspects. So our agenda, 15 minutes or so of talking about types of rendering and maybe questioning what those mean. 10 minutes or so of applying some of those techniques, looking at an example, reflecting on the lessons. And then before that, a few minutes of intro, and what my father would call twaddle. But we're through that now. We are into our first section. So examining rendering. So forgive me if some of these acronyms you've heard of before, but terminology is one of those things in, technology and the web that can be very confusing. As I said, naming is hard. And as promised, here is that slide. There's no escaping it. It was coming at you. There are some terms in there. And I'll address some of those, and as I say, some of those you'll be very, very familiar with, and some people may not. So let's bring everyone along for the ride, and then talk about some areas where I think there's a bit of confusion. Let's start first of all, and that animation is now gone, with SSG. You heard that phrase earlier on. Where does that happen, and when does that happen? Well, let's use this little diagram a few times during these kind of clarifications about the different places rendering can happen. This happens in a build server. This happens outside of the remit of the request chain, if you like. It happens before your users even come along and even know that they're going to make a request to something. It's something that we can do in infrastructure was abstracted away. I like this because it puts some distance between the complexity and where failure can happen and the user. I love creating that distance so that the mistakes, if you like, stay in your kitchen, never leave and go to the dining room. And so this is happening that's before requests are made. This is the way we always used to do things in the days of old, but it was kind of fell out of favor until CI/CD came along, continuous integration, continuous deployment. This really unlocked the potential in doing things in a build step. Automating things became far more attractive. And I was kind of enticed by this years ago as GitHub Pages started to become much more powerful, started to be able to kind of automate the build of using a Jekyll static site generator. I got quite impressed by that. Netlify came along a bit later on and did that for other types of technology and builds. But the idea that you can have automation that really reduces the friction in building things and then getting them out onto the web was really, really exciting. And that kind of, made a real resurgence in static site generation. If you'll just indulge me a little bit, again, I know this is a little bit hard to read, so I'll try and make sure I read these things out. This is the way I used to look at hosting things on the web. It's a bit simplified for the illustration of this. We had different types of clients that would make requests, and those requests would travel across the internet and then perhaps reach our load balancers, which would spread out those requests across a bunch of different web servers or application servers, which would generate a response for them by, in turn, going and talking to different database servers, and those would return the response up the chain and then deliver it to the users. And so I quite enjoyed the idea of getting rid of a lot of that and instead pre-generating things, putting them on some sort of optimized hosting environment like a content delivery network, a CDN, that is really intended just to serve pre-generated assets and taking all of the work and the failure points out of the way there. And this was only become, as I say, viable since we're starting to automate these stages of running a build, perhaps triggering that on code or content or changes to other things in our environment. The fact that we can do this ahead of time, so that any errors we're aware of and the user ever gets exposed to, is really exciting to me. There's lots of opportunities that come from that. Okay, let's move on. Let's get through some of these other acronyms. There are a lot on that screen, and I want to rattle some of these out. Now, this one won't seem like a surprise. CSR, client-side rendering, that seems very, very self-explanatory. And indeed, that's the kind of thing that's happened and become an option now that JavaScript runtimes are much more powerful in the browsers. JavaScript is a lot less fault tolerant than HTML. Browsers, handle errors and discrepancies in HTML very, very well. JavaScript, we have to do that work ourselves. So it does put a larger onus on the developer to do a really good job of that. Harry Roberts, who's a performance consultant, talks about CSR as the fastest way to build the slowest websites. I don't think he's right, of course, but it's not entirely fair because we can do wonderful things with client-side rendering as well. But it's like any tool, we can use them to do good things and we can use them poorly. And it's certainly a trap that's caught us a lot of time. When does this happen? Well, the rendering happens when the browser's received all the assets. We deliver the JavaScript and then we have to unpack it, parse it, and then do our rendering. Or indeed, it happens when the user interacts with the site. So this is very tempting to us because it allows us to build lots of interactive and very seemingly performant things that react to the user interactions. But it's not without risks because we've got to handle all of those edge cases as well. Okay, I'm moving on rapidly because we've got things to get through. So SSR, server-side rendering. Oddly, this is the phrase that I've seen actually generate some of the most confusion. And it's odd because it feels like it ought to be very self-explanatory, but naming is hard. So when does that happen? Well, where does that happen? It happens on the server, on the application server. When does it happen? It happens at request time. So not beforehand, it happens in response to every particular request that's coming from the client. But the thing that I often hear people describe is actually it happening in all of these different places, not just on the server. And if we just unpack that a little bit more for a moment, I can understand why this happens because CSR, things happening in the client side, that's very self-explanatory. It's there. And then the other side of that is the other stuff. It's not client side, it's the other stuff. And often that gets all lumped together as happening server side because it's not client side. But is it client side? No, it's not client side. But it's all of the other things. So SSR often gets used as a general term for all of these places, all of these times. Really, it's not. It really is very specifically on some sort of server infrastructure or server code. We'll unpack that again in a moment. But critically, in response to requests that happen and not ahead of time. Okay, ESR, edge-side rendering. Now, this is a phrase of old that has been around for decades, particularly for giant kind of CDN infrastructure that used to be not very accessible to many of us, but only really the domain of very wealthy enterprises that could get expensive CDN companies to come and build out their infrastructure. Now it's much more accessible to more of us. So this term is returning to us. And this is happening not on a server, but on the edge of a CDN. So in other words, a content delivery network, which is geographically spread around the world, has different nodes on it, and having code that is executed close to where your users are at the edge of that network means that we can do things that are very, very performant, very, very low latency, but also have some kind of contextual awareness of where that user is. So we can do geolocation and localization and the like. And so that is another type of rendering that has now become an option to us. As I mentioned, it happens here in that little flow. And I think one of the things that's really allowed this to happen is the proliferation of serverless runtimes. If we go back to this little diagram for a moment, these serverless runtimes now can happen out of the edge of the network and in other places in the serving infrastructure. That means that we can do things in response to requests without having to maintain a server of our own. And so this is very, very exciting to me. And we'll look at an example of this down the line. So you might be asking then which one of these is best, because I rattle out a load of examples. And my answer is, it depends. And your response might be, yeah, great. It depends is actually a really underrated answer to questions. It's a really invaluable answer, as long as it's followed by this question, it depends on what. That really is an important stage to go through when we're deciding how we design our solutions. And so I'm kind of glad you asked that, which I know you were doing. And so, I'll come to this again and say that my preference is always to adopt the thing which is the least powerful that solves the problem that's at hand. If you ask for recommendations for things, you often get sold on the biggest, most powerful, most complex solution to those problems. But I love seeking out the subtlety and the simplicity and things that can solve that problem. So that's my preference, but that's not really an answer to the question you were all asking. I'd also say that server-side doesn't necessarily mean server-full. This is kind of taken from a conversation on Twitter, where, of course, all good nuanced debate happens. And in that conversation, I was saying that if I can do things in advance, I will. But if I can't do things in advance, I can do things with serverless infrastructure, I'll do that. But if I can't do things with serverless infrastructure, but I can add a server, I will. So I'm never really dealing in absolutes. I'm just saying I like to layer things on in complexity when it's warranted and when it's demanded, rather than going for the most potent, most powerful solution right out the gate. I like this idea of increments. And speaking of increments, there are more acronyms for us to deal with, and these are all to deal with kind of incremental rendering. There's good news here for you. There are 5 items on the screen. One of them is not true. The last one is my reaction to that, so we can take that one away. There's more good news for you. 3 of these actually basically mean the same thing, and in some circumstances, so does the other one. The first 3, DPR, ODB, DSG, these all phrases that came from Netlify and from Gatsby. And so you may know that Netlify acquired Gatsby Inc. Earlier in the year. So perhaps those 3 terms will arrive into one term and it'll be simplified. How naive of you to think that. If I just give you a tiny glimpse into our company Slack after this acquisition happened, there were debates about, what should this company now be called? Should it be called Gatlify? Should it be called Netsby? Should it be called Getslify? There are nice responses to these. Natsflibby was the final, and I don't think it's a surprise to any of us that was a runaway winner in this conversation. It was a genuine conversation in our Slack. Once again, naming is hard. And so, it seems, is logo design. Made as a new logo, where do I send the invoice? Natsflibby, the future is now. Sorry for the diversion. Let's get back to this. So if you thought these terms might consolidate onto one, I don't think it's going to happen. But let's describe what they are anyway. So distributed consistent rendering, on-demand builders, and deferred static generation. These all effectively refer to the same thing. I mentioned it's about incremental builds. So DPR, Netlify wrote an RFC a while ago trying to describe an approach to progressive rendering for the long tail of builds, if you like. And in doing that, what we were hoping is that it would mean that people could adopt this model with their own implementations, whatever those might be called. The implementation that Netlify came out with first was on-demand builders, as it was called. And at a similar time, Gatsby released something called deferred static generation. Both of these are an implementation of that model at the top. I'll be honest, I really prefer the Gatsby naming of this. Deferred static generation seems really descriptive to me. What it really means is when we're creating views, we don't necessarily need to generate them in the build. So a particular view of a URL doesn't need to be generated in the build. Wait until the first time it's requested, then generate it and add it to what was built earlier. The acronym for that is challenging. So we'll stick with the others. As I said, naming is hard. And, this is kind of possible, again, because of this proliferation of serverless runtimes and the ability to do things in the same kind of workflow and tool chain. So effectively what this means is some of the assets are built at build time and then pushed to a CDN in a deploy. Others, they happen on request through serverless environments. Again, those assets are pushed to the CDN so that they're available for future requests. So that kind of deals with those three. The other one, ISR, let's talk about that as well, because it kind of means the same thing, but there's some subtle differences. So ISR, incremental static regeneration. This was implemented in Next.js. It was an implementation of the stale while revalidate caching model. And just to illustrate that in relation to ODB, which you spoke about just a moment ago, where a render of a particular view hasn't happened until a user comes along and asks for it. They make that request, and then the view is generated. It's added to the cache of views that are available on URLs for future users then to hit those directly. Meanwhile, with ISR, what happens is a placeholder render is typically created, and then when the user comes along to ask for that for the first time, they're given that placeholder. But then the act of making that request will refresh that, will ask that view to be refreshed, updated, regenerated, if you like. So regeneration rather than generation. Often via client-side rendering, we get the updated information about that view, and then the rendering can happen as an update in the client side. This means that you get like a change in what's viewed. You often get that kind of holding state and then the refresh view. But then that later view is available for future users. So another user comes along and then they get the previously generated view, which is now stale, but then it gets refreshed again. And there are different kind of caching properties that you can handle with this. So you can configure this. In some ways, when you configure this, it behaves exactly as ODB, but there are some subtleties around it as well. So you might ask then, which is better, ISR or DBR? It depends. Of course it depends, because it depends on what we're building, what are our functional requirements, what are our non-functional requirements. And this is perhaps the message that I want to get across more than anything else today, in that deciding between these approaches and these technologies just really demands that we ask questions. And the biggest of those is, what are the requirements? So let's do that for a moment. I'm running a tiny bit behind, so I'll go as fast as I can here. Let's look at an example of deploying some of these different rendering techniques. So let's conjure an example together. So I have a website. You saw that domain earlier. You don't remember it. You don't remember how to spell it. That's fine. But on that site, I decided that I wanted to now start self-hosting a stash of all of my social media posts for reasons. And so I had some requirements for that. So first of all, I was going to now start having 24,000 or so new URLs, and I wanted a distinct, unique URL for each of those 24,000 tweets. I wanted to have an index page or set of index pages that listed the links to all of those things. I wanted those pre-generated so there was a URL that sites could spider and crawl and find all of my lovely content. I wanted the ability to search on my site those tweets and those set of content. I wanted my build time to remain something reasonable, because I regenerate my site and I don't want that build time to explode by the addition of 24,000 new URLs and views to generate. I wanted to avoid client-side rendering if possible, because I like to do this work ahead of time, and I also just want to avoid any of the potential breakages that might happen if I inevitably have a bug in my JavaScript. And I wanted a logical model that would fit in my head, because that sounds like there could be some complexity, and I wanted it to remain simple enough that I could hold it in my head. So I ended up with a solution that combines static site generation, on-demand builders, and edge-side rendering. And this is possible because the content that I'm displaying here is abstracted away. And this is a very common thing in the sites that we build now. We're using decoupled CMSs and other systems that present the content to us as structured data, in this case as JSON, JSON. I say that, I have no colleague called Jason, and it's not a new joke, it's not a funny joke, but I just heard myself say Jason instead of JSON, so apologies. But JSON makes that possible. And the fact that we can have a build which takes our structured data, applies it to our templates, and then generates a set of assets that we can serve very simply. That's where I started. And so I have that would then create all of the index pages and a lot of my content pages, so that when a user comes along, they make a request for it, they get a response. And this is kind of what that looks like. I know it's kind of hard for you to see. Is that playing? Oh yeah, it is playing. So here are my content pages, and I can page through them all. There are, I don't know, just short of 1,000 listing pages that have the URLs of my sites on them, of my tweets on them. You can find that URL and interrogate that yourself, should you. So great. So now I've been able to do that, to generate this content. In doing so, the build duration stayed around 2 seconds because it added 1,000 pages. It didn't add tens of thousands of pages. And a full deploy for that happened in about 30 seconds. Moving on, because time is against us. What are then about the unique URLs for each one of those individual tweets? Well, this seems like a perfect contender for an on-demand builder, because chances are not many people are going to, this isn't just me being realistic about my own content, but this is a large set of content, and not everyone is going to be looking at all of those. Some of those URLs may never be looked at, but if they are looked at, then I want to render them on demand and then make them available for future users as well. So if a request comes in for a particular page that hasn't been rendered yet, it will hit an on-demand builder function, which is a Lambda function, if you like. That will go and grab the same content from the same data from the same blob of JSON, add that, render that view, add that to the set of assets that are available as part of the site, and then return that to the user. So each post page progressively is created over time as people request them. And so that means that I have a permalink for each one of these things. You can't read that, I don't think, but I'll read it for you. Oh gosh. It says, starting my day making the perfect piece of buttered toast. This made me happy, end of message. So it's very important this content gets out into the world and you can enjoy that yourself at this URL. The content perhaps isn't the important thing in this particular demonstration. Okay, what about searching? How do we do the searching across that bit of content? Well, this seems like a good contender for an edge side rendering, because each of these searches might be unique. I wouldn't necessarily expect those to be cached and made available forever. Potentially they could, but this is the route I took. And so here I have a form on the page which makes a request to a URL. That URL is served by an edge side render function, which does the same thing. It goes and gets the data from the JSON, it applies it to a template, and then it creates that results page and it returns that to the user, meaning that we can have an experience which is kind of like what we'd expect with a serverful request response, where we're making a post request, or indeed a GET request in this case, to a form and getting a response. So here I am searching for the word render, and I don't see it over here, so I'm going to come over here and see what it says. So this one, there we are. My wife keeps sending me random pictures of our cat rendered as a cuddly toy. Okay, not specific to rendering, but you can see that nonetheless at this URL. Now, if you're wondering what this meant, when I travel, I get things like this, and like this. I don't even. What is that? What is happening there? Ken, I know, not a cat person. Don't worry, she did it for next door's dog as well. But that's not the point. The point here is that I'm trying to use the rule of least power to do these things progressively. I'm running a little short on time, but I do want to quickly talk about VPress, because I experimented with this using VPress, because VPress is great for generating pages, for doing SSG. And it's very simple for me then to also add a layer of on-demand builders and edge functions, as you just saw there. Because with VPress, again, you can abstract the content with JSON, so you can run a build at build time to generate some pages, but you can also access this at request time. And the way that I made it possible, I didn't discover anything. I wasn't like Evan with a test tube in a lab and discovered Vue. The way that I structured this response is that, in VPress, you can make data available to the templates in this convention where you export a load method which returns lots of JSON. I abstracted that again so that I could just have a naked kind of file of JSON data that I could use not only there but also in my on-demand builder function. And this is the entirety of that code for that. I'm not showing you a couple of things, but in short, I'll go through this quickly because I'm almost at time. I require a function which is like a helper function which tells Netlify how to handle the various caching and adding this as an on-demand builder with those characteristics I mentioned earlier on. I require that set of JSON so that I can interrogate that. So here is the content that's been abstracted away. And then I also have something I haven't shown you, which is basically a big string literal of a template file that I'll add the values into. And then my handle function will very kind of clumsily get the ID of that tweet from the URL, look that up from my blob of JSON, apply it to the template and return it. And that's kind of all it's doing in this function. But we could go further with this. We could use other tools that give us access to more things if we've decided that it's the appropriate thing to do, because Nuts supports, as we said earlier on, all of these different patterns for rendering. And it can allow you to use a configuration file to define what routes apply different types of rendering. I think that's really powerful and exciting, but it's really key that we understand why we're doing that and what is a good profile for each of those use cases. Okay, so I'm over time, so I should wrap up with my lessons here. So amid the confusion of all of these terms, what did we learn? Well, first of all, I really hope we've learned that there's no one right way to do things. We can achieve these things with lots of different approaches. But I really like the idea that if we can do work ahead of time, we should. I think we get lots of benefits from doing that. Critically, you can mix and match these approaches to rendering. And in fact, there's great power in doing so. You don't have to go for the biggest, heaviest, largest hammer right out the gate. But really, we should never choose that approach until we understand the requirements. So that's such an important message. The two last things we've learned is that not all of my tweets are pure gold and that naming is hard. So thank you so much for listening. If you do want more, you can find more tutorials and information about this kind of thing on this blog site. The Nuxt site has some great information about the concepts of rendering. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm happy to talk either here or on Twitter. So thank you so much for your attention and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks so much.